see my slides?
Yes, I can see them.
I'm using the screen sharing feature of Zoom, so I'm never quite sure. This technology is beyond me a lot of the times. And there's Anne. Hi, Anne. Could you tell me who you are?
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
My name is Anne, and
But now I can't.
sorry.
Maybe you're muted.
It's not muted. I think I come to Zoom calls.
Oh, sorry.
Anne is an operation analyst with the Division of Child Support Services, and she does a lot of our guidelines programming and testing.
Okay. And there's Linda and there's a Maggie here and a Larry.
Linda, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Linda Nichols. I have been with
Yes.
We saw it 3 times this week.
Oh, you know I wasn't saying that.
John, mute. I think that's you with make all the noise. Please mute.
So good to see you. How are you? Good. How are you?
Maggie and Larry. Oh, and Linda.
Hi, Maggie Hodges. I'm Shar Roberts' intern working on a master's of social work from Colorado State University.
Nice to have you. Well, maybe we should start. Thank you all for showing up. And maybe I should say something about who I am and why I'm here. So I'll try to go through my slides. That's who I am. And I'm teaching a full-time load this term. And thankfully, I'm not teaching by Zoom, which I did entirely last year. And my students hated it, and so did I. But we're in the classroom, and now I have to lecture through a mask, which isn't so pleasant, but it's better than the alternative. And I've been teaching economics for a lot of years, like 50. And so I think I got it down now, but who can say? And I've had a tour in the government, as it indicates there, at something called the Federal Trade Commission in Washington. And I write not only on child support issues, on children's issues, but on a lot of other factors as well. This is not my only professional interest. Let me say that unlike some others, I have absolutely no ulterior motives here. I have had consulting activities in the past, but never in child support areas. And what happened, this is a true story. I went to a conference back in 2003, and I learned for the first time that child rearing cost figures are not actual expenditures. That blew me away. I thought we could just measure them. But in fact, they're imputed values, not actual values. And indeed, there is a Minnesota report, which I cite here, which emphasizes that these are acknowledged as imputed values. And so I think we need to talk right from the start as to the adequacy of the imputed values which are used to represent child rearing expenditures. Okay, so I'll leave that to you. Okay, let's go on. A number of you have turned off your cameras. May I request that you keep them on so I'm talking to people's heads and not to their names? it matters to me. And I know that seems peculiar, but it's so different to talk to a person than to a name. And so if you could, and that includes, I mean, I see some names, but at least I see more faces. I tell that to my students as well. Oh, the second thing I want to emphasize is that in my classes, like here, it is polite to interrupt. I do not want you to use the hand raising feature of Zoom because I don't understand it. And I don't want you to hold off on your questions till a later point. And so feel free to interrupt me. My wife does all the time, and so do my students. So there's no reason why you guys shouldn't do it as well. So please feel free to do so. I really would rather have a conversation than me talking at you. All right? So please take that admonition seriously. Okay, I learned that child rearing expenditures, which underlie child support award amounts, are imputed values, not actual values, which is something I never really understood. I thought it would be just measurements, but it's not. And I said, well, why is that? And I spent a bit of time trying to estimate actual expenditures on child support amounts by comparing statistically similar families, similar households, with and without children. And it took me well over a decade with a couple of co-authors to actually estimate these numbers. So the conference was held in 2003, and I finally published my paper in 2015. Academia, as you can tell, is a very long-lasting enterprise. All right? And my aim is to try to explain to you what difference it makes when you measure child rearing costs as compared with imputing child rearing costs. And that's what we're going to spend a good deal of time on. What's interesting is I looked at recently a paper by Dr. Venohr, and here's the citation for that paper. And she said that the goal, as implied in the legislation, is to measure child rearing expenditures. But the striking feature is that is not, in fact, what is done. And to say that it can't be done is just incorrect. Let me talk about the model that many states use, which Dr. Venohr advances, and which forms the basis of the Colorado child support guidelines from the past. Right? And I think the way to deal with this issue is to give you an example. Right? The example isn't perfectly correct, but it's close enough, and it really illustrates the issues that I want to discuss. Let's look at the first point here. Let me look at this example. Let me consider a hypothetical case where a childless couple is living in a 2-bedroom apartment with the second bedroom used as a den. And now a child arrives, and the den is transformed into a nursery. And there's no additional housing expenditures. This is hypothetical. It's not a correct story, but it illustrates the issue that I think is before us, and which I'm going to ask you what you think about this issue. You're not going to get away with just listening to me. I really want your responses to my questions as well. And so then the question is, what are the actual expenditures for the child in this case, in this hypothetical case? And the answer is no monetary expenditures. They've just transformed the den into a nursery. At the same time, it is correct to say that the family that had the child is out a den. They used to have a den, and now they don't have a den. And so the issue is whether or not the family with the child should be compensated for the loss of the den. And what your child support awards do now is essentially aim to compensate the family with children for the loss of the den, and calling that child rearing costs. The issue which I really want to talk about is whether or not the compensation that is paid to the family with children who did indeed lose the den, I mean, that's correct in my hypothetical, is correctly a portion of child rearing costs. And that is in effect what is going on today. And that's, I can suggest to you, is a difficult issue. And I don't want you to think that I'm making this up. And this is a statement from a report done for the California legislature back in 2011. And it was done by Dr. Betson, who is Dr. Venohr's associate. Maybe you've met him, but you certainly have heard his name. And please read this quotation, which I take directly, quote unquote, not changing a word, from his statement. And you can read it as well as I can. I assume you can all see that on your screen. These are his words. He says the childless couple is wealthier because they have the use of the den. Well, in some sense, that is correct. But then to equalize the position of the two families, we must provide a supplement to the family with the children to compensate them for the loss of the den. And that compensation is a substantial feature of existing child support awards. And the one thing I would say about Dr. Benson, although I've never met him in person, but we have corresponded, is that he's quite honest with that, and he's open about that. And I give him full marks for his openness. But that is the issue, whether or not this is the way child rearing costs should be noted. So let me look at the question. And I'll leave you to read those slides. I don't need to read them myself for you. And I want to know what you think as to whether child support obligations should be imposed for the loss of the den, and not, in some sense, for reimbursing actual expenditures, because by my example, there are no actual expenditures. Right? Let me ask you what you think about it. Who can I ask? Brandy, you're the first person on my screen in my little boxes. What do you think about that?
I can definitely see where somebody, without the child, I'm in agreement. I think they would be monetarily, they would have a better monetary situation than the person with the child, because that den could have been used for an office. And now that they're not using it as an office, they may have to go into the office now. They may have additional costs to either like rent another building to use as an office. So I'm kind of in agreement with that also.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. So you're comparing it not with an office and a nursery, not a den and an office and a den and a nursery. You know, fair enough. I mean,
Well, 'cause we don't know what exactly they're using the den for. I mean,
exactly
the
right.
den could be very widely used. So
It could be and it could not be. That's the
Yeah.
issue. But you're, at least we agree that that's the issue, isn't it?
yes, that is.
And the issue is whether or not the family with children needs to be compensated for the loss of the den.
Yeah.
And there are two sides of that story.
Can I interject?
Sure.
So, me and my partner, we had a Airbnb for about 2 years, and that got converted into a little girl's room, so that we could have her in our house instead of our Airbnb guests. And so we actually had a loss of income because of that loss of Airbnb income, just because we had a child.
And sure, but it's not an expenditure, but it's an imputed amount equal to the loss of your Airbnb.
Exactly.
Fair enough. I'm sure there are cases like that as well. Let me hear from some of the rest of you. Maggie.
I mean, I think my biggest thing with this is that the scenario kind of sounds ridiculous because in the setup, because like others have said,
Hold on, I'm hearing a lot of excess noise.
Does anybody mind muting themselves unless they're speaking?
All right, now the noise went away. Can we get back to that, Maggie?
that noise is from me. I'm in the coffee shop right now because I can't be at home, so there's a lot of background.
Okay, we'll go. I'd rather listen to you and worry about forget about the coffee shop noise.
Maggie, do you want to chat it and I'll read it to the group?
Perfect.
Okay.
Hey, Doc, this is Carl, if I could say something.
Sure.
Again, kind of almost to the point of it doesn't, whether you agree with this logic or not, regardless of which side of this coin you are on, ultimately, for a lot of people, this is where the conflict and the problem stems from. So the outcome of how this is computed within our system, today it's included in our system or in our calculations. At least in my vernacular, that is the foundation where so much of the societal problem or the financial incentive of custody comes from.
All right, we'll talk about the actual numbers and how it's computed. And I want to think about what Michael and Brandy said, but we'll think about that later if we can. But I just want to talk about the principle. All right. And
Dr.
Maggie,
Comanor.
yeah.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt Maggie
Oh,
if
please,
she's going to
yes,
speak, but
interruptions are good.
okay. Well, I'm literally sitting in that den right now because I have just now a 3-month-old. So I don't know, you maybe can't see behind me, but there's a bassinet back there. And this is normally my wife's office, but she's off for a few more weeks and then we'll go back to work. But anyways, I think my point was that yes, we've lost the use of this room to a certain extent, and it's not an expenditure, though we no longer can stay in this condo, and maybe that's a personal choice, but in order to successfully work from home and have a child, we need another room at this point. So we're getting by until we can move to a larger house. And then to me, that does seem like an expenditure, that we will be paying more to have the space that we need to, essentially live our lives the way they were prior to having a child, as far as having space to meet our professional and personal needs.
Look, you're exactly right, but it's an imputed value, And I'm not saying it's not a resulting of the child, but it is an imputed value, right? And I want to look at some numbers later on in the presentation to see how much the imputed values amount to. But the first issue is whether or not it's appropriate. And I'm getting many statements that it is appropriate to include them in child rearing losses, but not actual expenditures. Is that a fair statement? Joel, is that a fair statement?
Sure. I didn't know if that was directed to me or the whole group, but yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Maggie,
I thought, Joel, I'm sorry, Doctor. I thought, Joel, you said you will be expending more because you're moving.
Yes, sorry, maybe I misunderstood, and it could be the lack of sleep that I have been getting.
You're entitled.
So will you repeat your question, Dr. Comanor?
Sure. You may have to move because you work at home. If you didn't work at home, would you move?
Possibly, because we would still be losing the use of this space that we didn't have before.
Correct.
Or
But
that
would
we
you
had
move for
before.
that? Would you move for that?
Possibly. I mean, with a child, yes.
With the child, but no,
If we hadn't had a child, there wouldn't be a need to move.
right. But if you have the child, would you give up the use of the den if you needed the money?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, yeah, it's hard to say.
It is hard to say. That's fair enough. And in fact, the increase in people working at home makes the den a more valuable piece than otherwise. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if we absolutely, if it were that we can't use the den, truly can't use it, or it's an office in this case, then that would mean we would have had to move the day he was born.
Correct.
If you see what I'm saying, and we didn't do that. So yes, we're making a choice to use this room for multiple purposes, though we aren't even using it to its full extent that it was used before, because my wife's not back at work yet. So once she's back at work, then it truly is not usable as a place for the child as well as her working. So I think at that point it will be we will have to move, and then it's a true expenditure.
If the child is in school, would you still have to move?
I mean, if they're in, we don't have a bedroom for them, so yes.
Well,
we don't have a separate bedroom.
No.
I mean, if you're saying, could it be used as an office during the day on a child's room at night? I mean, I think that comes down to, is it possibly? But then you have a child's, I think that depends on your employer. Can you have a child's bed and other child items all around you in your office?
I can't answer that question.
Yeah, I know I can't answer that either.
All right.
I think
Anybody else?
Another really interesting piece of this is individual income levels, right? Because if you're used to living, and even maybe culture, to be quite honest, if you're used to living together in smaller quarters, you may do that longer than somebody that has means and isn't used to living, all together. So I think maybe the question that I keep thinking about is, who is responsible for that expenditure? The parent that decides to accrue that and have that expenditure, or the other parent that doesn't necessarily have the child? I guess that's maybe another question.
But that's a relevant question. It's not just whether there's additional costs, additional outlays. I don't know that I call it cost, but different expenditure patterns. But who should be responsible for bearing those expenditures? Maggie, I never heard you got your comments, and Do we have it through a
We
lease?
do, especially in today's pandemic world, the loss of space to anything is noticeable and becomes expensive. This imputed value is still a cost to parents.
Well, that's fair enough. It can be a cost of parent if you would use the space for income producing needs. Is it, suppose you do not use it for income producing needs, would it then be a cost?
Well, you're losing value to your house, right? To a degree, like you don't have access to as much shared space, common area.
Well, I don't know. I have had 3 children. They're all grown now. And I found my shared space more valuable when the kids were there than when they left, and it became very lonely. It just depends, doesn't it? And look, the positions I got from Michael and Brandy really had to do with this. The lost den was income producing, and maybe that's more common in today's day and age in the pandemic. And the issue, and I guess the question is, suppose it sounds more a cost when it's income producing than otherwise. Is that fair? Maggie is shaking her head, so I'm glad about that.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, I'm a few years ahead of Joel on that situation, in that I did move when the pandemic hit and everybody had to be at home, so it became an imperative. We had to opt for more space, and I don't know. I don't see it as I'm not getting it, I guess. It feels like a loss in any way that you look at it, and whether it's cash money or not, there's still a value assigned to it. So there's and I don't know if it's the same way, like this idea of imputation, it exists we do that with people's incomes, so to the extent we're okay with imputing incomes, imputing expenditures, how is that much different?
It might not be. Who I don't see you talking to me. Who just spoke?
Oh, sorry, that was me, Maria Jose. I'm also in a coffee shop.
Oh, I don't see you,
So
Maria.
I have my camera off.
Oh, well, no wonder I don't see you. All right. Okay. Fair enough.
I might add something.
Sure.
Since I lost my Airbnb, who's paying me or compensating me for my loss of income?
I don't know the answer to that question. What's the answer?
I don't know, but in our family, there's nobody, right? But in a single parent household, they do get it, or if they're getting child support, at least.
That's right. Look, I don't have an answer to that, but at least you're asking the right question. And the right question is, how much should the loss of the den be imputed? What should it be? And should that be treated the same as actual expenditures, additional expenditures on the nursery? In fact, when you move to a nursery, typically people spend more on housing, and I'll show you some numbers in a moment. But I'm asking now, not actual expenditures, but how it should be imputed. Any further comments before I go on?
Well, I would say that, it would have to be on a case-by-case basis. Just like imputing income is a case-by-case basis. We don't impute income on every single case. You have to have a checklist, and they have to meet criteria to have it imputed. I would think the expenditures would be a lot like the same, where you would still have to have a case-by-case basis, and it would depend. I mean, if it's a married couple that decide, I mean, such as Joel's case, it's a married couple that decide they're going to move for the benefit of their child and they want to make that sacrifice. But then if they were to split, I would think that that case, you would add those expenditures because it was a mutual decision at the time of the move. If it's a case that a single parent decides to move based on, you know, they've got APR and they decide to move because they're not liking their household or the way that it is, that would not be imputed because the single parent is making that decision on their own.
Right, but I made the decision to not use the Airbnb for this little girl, right? But I don't get any entitlements to an income for the compensation I've lost.
So there's a couple of comments in the chat that I just want to read aloud. It is a sacrifice that has to be made for the benefit of your children. Sacrifice or investment, depending on your point of view. Who are we to say if the home should be imputed because of a loss of room? It may be a matter of an opinion, as there could be other options to work, say a basement. I also have the question of, are we talking about the cost of housing being a part of the formula versus an adjustment or an imputation after the fact? It seems like maybe this is a both and possibly, but I think my question is thinking about the formula that is developed to come up with a suggested child support amount. How is housing included in that housing specifically for this child, whether it's we convert the den or not?
Look, I think what Brandy said is exactly right. That it is different and it'd be wonderful to do it on a case-by-case basis. But in setting guidelines, you obviously have to take some sort of averages, right? Because it applies to everybody. And then the issue is, how frequently do we have the den being used as an office or as an Airbnb? And how frequently is it used or not used when you have when it's turned into a nursery? And I don't know the answer to that question. We don't have data on that. Let me go back to Brandy. What do you think about that? If you thought it, even though you're right, of course, it should be on a case-by-case basis. Suppose you had to make a general rule. What's then your rule?
I would say it would probably follow a lot like the imputation of income. You know, where you have certain criteria you have to meet or certain checklist you have to go off of to determine if that case would meet the guidelines to have that expenditure added.
So you would add to the guidelines a checklist.
Yes.
And that checklist should be part of the guidelines.
Correct.
That sounds right to me. Is that what's done?
I don't believe not for expenditures. We, through Child Support Services, have a guideline or have an imputation checklist that when we're doing guidelines, we have to meet that checklist in order to impute income to a case.
All right.
Whether the courts use that same guideline when they're doing it on their own, I'm not sure. It would be a judge by judge case, I'm thinking.
All right. So you would put forth in your guidelines this checklist as to when and when not these imputed values should be included.
I think that would be most beneficial.
Well, that's a big difference. Elise, what do you think of that?
I think that would get to be very interesting. I'm just thinking about in practice how that could look and who determines the value, right? So if they're in Kiowa or they're in Denver, the value obviously looks very different. How do you determine the value? How do you determine if it was necessary? Because I could easily say, Joel, nope, you have to stay in that where you're at, right? Like I could say that is a reasonable square footage. Or I could say, absolutely not, Joel, you should be able to have a larger space for your children. So I think it just could be very interesting.
Well, I don't have an answer, but I'm really happy to see people asking themselves this question. And
Isn't it more, if I could interrupt, isn't it
who am
more
I hearing
of,
from? Who am I hearing from?
this is Maria Jose again.
Okay.
Okay, so isn't it more of the exception to the rule that somebody isn't just eating up more space within their home and like taking over the living room, or, you know, that people even have an extra space to eat up? I mean, a lot of people don't have extra space or an extra room that they could magically convert. So it seems to me that it's more of the special exception if, you know, to take that away, you know, similar to when somebody's like living with their parents, you know, like somebody moves in with their parents and suddenly their housing is subsidized, right? As opposed to the other parent who doesn't have, you know, the child's grandparents that they can move into and, you know, help out with childcare, et cetera. You know, it seems more the exception than anything else.
And then I would imagine that'd be more, I mean, again, when you talk about exception, that'd be dependent upon the economic class, low income versus middle versus higher, upper income.
What's striking to me is that different people have different uses for the room that used to be, that now has become the nursery. And maybe much depends on what that room was used for before the child arrived, or would be used alternatively.
So if I get my child support imputed for a den that's being used for another child or my child, right? But I've lost essentially a tax deduction because my my den is no longer being used, right? It's for this little one. Should I apply to the government to ask for funds for that? Or what I guess I'm asking is, why are we treating single parent households differently than everybody else?
That's a fair statement. All right, but look, at least I've got you talking about what seems to me the critical issue for child support decisions, for child support guideline decisions. Should the imputed values, which are not direct expenditures, lead to increased or enhanced child support payment awards? That's the question, isn't it? So at least I'll have you thinking about that, which is as much as perhaps I can hope to. All right. Let me go through. I'm through more of my slides. And here is indeed the argument that was made by Dr. Venohr. That's her position, and you can read it. And you can see what I have here at the bottom. The fundamental principle, which some of you documented, is that parents are worse off because they share their common goods with their children. And Michael is worse off in the sense that he has to share his office with his child, although he doesn't look very worse off now, if I may say so. And Joel is worse off because he gives up his Airbnb. Is that's you, right, Joel?
No, that was Michael.
Oh, I got it mixed up. Sorry about that. My fault. But you were worse off because you had to share your room with your child, right? And that's the essence. Whether or not you're worse off because you share your rooms with your children, or whether you're better off when you share your rooms with your children. I don't know about you, but when my kid moved out at the age in his 20s, as he should have, I cried for 3 days. Now I got over it, but it didn't seem to me a positive at all. And in fact, I keep calling him because he lives in the city, same city I live in. When is he coming over? And he keeps saying, Dad, I'm busy. Well, you know, so it's not clear to me which way the calculus works. And maybe it can work both ways. Is that fair?
Well, I'd have to say morale has definitely improved around here. So it's a positive in my eyes. And she's not on payroll yet, but definitely hope to be at some point. So I don't think there's a negative there, is what I'm saying.
Do you feel you need to be compensated for having the child because she takes up part of your room?
Not at all.
Well, that's the other side. And Maggie, obviously, not Maggie, Brandy, maybe disagrees. Is that fair? On average?
Like I said, it would really be a case-by-case decision.
Yeah, of course.
So, at face value, if Michael does, separate and something happens, then, maybe it's a case that, it was a comment or it was a decision they made together, then maybe it would be so.
Look, the problem is we have people with Brandy's views and we have people with Michael's views, and how to find a common ground is not such an easy thing. Is that a fair statement? Let me go on. But I hope you agree with what I'm saying here. That's the premise, and maybe it's supportable and maybe it's not.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Though, so housing aside, because that may be different, but food and transportation, the cost wouldn't be the same post-child.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about that in specific. I'm using this because it's such a good example.
Okay.
And I don't want to say that's the norm. I don't even want to say it's correct. It's a hypothetical, but as you can see, it gets us talking, doesn't it? I mean, the goal, I treat this as a class. My goal is not to tell the kids, my students, what to think. My goal is to get them thinking about it for themselves. And that's the only way I know how to deal with these things. Right? I'm in class tomorrow, and I assume I'll behave exactly the same way. Here's the issue. Because the way it's done now, children is viewed as strangers, and therefore you have to be compensated. But Michael's position is the opposite. They're family members whose presence is joy that gains you something rather than loses you something. Now, the person who dealt with Airbnb, and I've forgotten who it is, they lose something, right? They lose the Airbnb revenue. And so the issue is whether or not the loss of the den and the inclusion of the child in the household costs you something or embellishes your life. And it's not a cost. But at the very least, you should understand that a large share of the reported values of the cost of rearing children have little to do with expenditures on children. They have to do with compensation for the loss of your living space, loss of the full use of your living space. Is that fair? Does anybody disagree with that? That's what I wanted to get across.
Well, are we only talking about this particular example or in general? Because
I'm going to talk about in general later on, but the principle, but the other cases are more nuanced. This is so clear, which is why I like to focus on it. Does that make sense?
It seems to me like it's both. I mean, I certainly love my son, but he's also a cost. you know, he's a joy and a cost at the same time.
What about that? Do you feel you need to be compensated because of the loss of the room? Well, maybe if it's an income producing room, that's one thing. And maybe if it's not an income producing room, it's another. How many?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not asking for compensation from anyone because I'm co-parenting with my wife, but if we lived separately, then I would expect that we'd support each other financially.
But should this be a part of the compensation? That's the issue. If you were living separately and you agreed to compensate the other party in terms of direct expenditures, should this compensation for the loss of the room be part of that compensation?
I don't know. I'm still thinking about that one.
I mean, that's the question, it seems to me.
I do appreciate your perspective, Joel, because I think, you know, when parents are no longer intact, it feels differently. It may look differently. I also think the language around compensation makes it feel like someone's making money off of this, when in fact, I don't know that anybody is really making money.
Right. I think I would just add, so not compensating, but where's the place where, so if you're a parent and you have the child in your home and you have the den, you would like to move to a larger home to have a bedroom for your child, but you can't afford to do that because the other parent isn't contributing anything financially. Like, I'm with you as far as, I really do think I'm leaning towards that side of like that actual expenditure is really what we should be looking at. The problem is, what if you don't, the only reason you're not expending it is because you don't have the money to do so. If you did have the money to do it, you would be able to provide a better, an actual room for your child, that sort of thing. So where's that kind of flipping point where it actually is something that should be included as far as a cost?
And kind of to your Bet's point in the chat, again, depends on if you're trying to level out lifestyles, which is one of those things that I have a real hard time with. And I think that's part of the point that Dr. Comanor is making, or if you're trying to provide for the children. So that's, again, and as many of y'all have heard me say, is again, the more we separate time and money, the easier it is to figure out both. And the more we distinguish between child true benefit versus sharing adult expenditures like housing, that's where a lot of the conflict comes from.
There's some truth in that, in that the child, in my example, has the same room regardless. And the issue is, how much should the parent be compensated because they've lost something in the form of the physical use of the den or the office, if you'd like. All right, let's go on. All right, now we've talked about this in principle, and there are differing views. But first, we also have to ask, how are imputed valuations made? Because it's one thing to say you should be imputed in terms of the value of the den. The issue is, how do we do that? And more important, how is it done under current standards? How is it done? And what, in fact, the current Betson-Rothbarth models do is use some crazy sense, an adult clothing theory of well-being. You can read what it says. And in fact, this is acknowledged. So my point is, this is the way it is done currently. Maybe it's the best possible way, but this is the way it's done. And to the extent that I have some references, it comes out of these reports, largely to California. Any comments about that? Here is a quote from Dr. Venohr's appendix in the Nebraska report. And you can read it. And when I give you something in quotes, it's fully accurate, and you can certainly check it out because I give you the footnote. What is striking is the way in which the data is being used. The Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is exactly the same data that I use, that Betson used, uses it to measure adult children expenditures with families with and without children. Well, I use it to use expenditures on children. How much more does a family with a child spend on food than a family without children for the same income level? And the only difference being, as close as I can get it statistically, is the number of children. But we all use the same data. Another approach when using adult clothing as the decision variable is that people's preferences change. When you have a child, you often spend less on clothing because you stay home. You don't go out as much. But is that a cost of the child? Is that because your preferences have changed or because you have less money? Essentially, the method used here is implying that your preferences are the same and that you're simply spending less money on adult clothing because the child is taking up these funds. So effectively, it's saying that the cost of the children is the differential expenditures in adult clothing. But it assumes that your preferences are the same for adult clothing. That hardly is the case. And in fact, there's a good deal of economic literature suggests that you really shouldn't do this. And I know this is more technical than the stuff we had before. So maybe there are fewer comments. Does anybody want to say anything?
I mean, I guess I'll say something. Isn't child support originally legally considered a debt that doesn't have an original creditor?
I don't understand. Maybe you could explain what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, in a legal context, no matter what the total is, it's still considered a debt.
No, but we're talking about what are the expenditures which underlie the child support award amounts.
Right, that make up that number.
I think you're on a different point, Michael.
Okay.
Any other comments? Elise, what do you think about that?
I think I need more time to think through it.
I mean, it is what underlies the Colorado award guideline amounts. It's assuming that the essential assumption is that preferences for adult clothing are the same with and without children, and it's only you have less money and therefore you spend less, rather than any notion that preferences might have changed.
How do you measure that? What would your recommendation be?
I don't know how to do it, but I can tell you that the way it's done now is problematic.
Well,
Can I,
Let me go through. Right now, we've got 4 issues with this model that in fact is being used. One is, are the households worse off by sharing their goods with the children? That they need to be compensated? That this can be measured by the increased expenditures on adult children in childless households, and that preferences necessarily are the same. Seems to me that the current basis of child support awards requires answers to all these questions.
can I clarify with the clothing example? I guess to clarify, when you're citing to clothing, is that an example? That's one of the
No,
things the model looks at, or that's the sole?
that's the sole
thing.
basis of determining child support, child rearing costs under the Betson-Rothbarth model. That's the sole purpose. There's no other thing that they look at.
I'm sorry, just for clarification, they also are looking at housing.
No, they don't. They don't look at housing. They just look at child support awards. I mean, at clothing.
On the Betson-Rothbarth model doesn't include housing?
They impute this to, they don't give you numbers for housing and food or anything else. They give you a single number. And the single number comes out of the differential in adult clothing expenditures. You can look it up. I mean, they're really quite honest about that. And if anybody wants a statement about that from Dr. Betson, you can find that in an appendix he wrote to for the California legislature. I don't want you to take my imputation of what he says by myself. I'll send you his award, his appendix if you want. Very few people read appendices, but it's there. And if anybody needs that, you know, I have it somewhere in my office.
Do please send that to Elise later.
All right. Elise, are you okay with that?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, we just got a rainstorm, so I had to go get my animals.
Of course you did. Of course. No issue. No issue. All
Yes,
right.
send me whatever. I'm happy to.
Okay, I will. Those are the 4 questions which I think need to be asked. Now, let me give you, this is a judgment which is made in an economics journal, and you can read it by a very well-known economist. The Rothbarth model has no standing in the economics profession, but it has a great deal of standing in the child support community. And so I guess why I'm here is to try to translate what the view is in economics, in the economic literature, to a different group of people. And I can send you that reference as well. And you can see what he says. Let me look at the numbers. I think it's, you know, we've talked a lot about principles. Let's look at what the numbers show. And how do I measure actual child rearing expenditures? Well, for the joint costs, which are called household collective goods, I try to compare using regression analysis, which some of you may have used in the past, expenditures of households with children as compared with households without children. And all that is published in this research paper that I published some years back. And this is in fact what I did. And you can read what's in the slide. while the Rothbarth model compares similar families on adult children, I compare them with housing and food and transportation and child clothing and child care and education. And so my research paper did all these comparisons. In some sense, it represents the incremental monetary cost of having a child. But let me be honest about this. It says nothing about the imputed values of the den or any other household good. I don't know how to measure that, and I don't. So I don't call it economic costs, I call it monetary costs. Monetary costs defined as the additional direct expenditures on the child. And admittedly, it doesn't deal with the things that some of you mentioned before, that Brandy mentioned and that Joel mentioned. Right? It just doesn't deal with that. Or Mike, maybe it was Michael that dealt with it. Right? She says that one should use the consumer expenditure survey, and on this we fully agree. She uses the same data set that I do, so there's no difference in the data set. And what we did is we use regression analysis to compare, and we do it for 3 different income classes. And we use income within these classes, but we thought it would be better because people spend so much behave differently at different income levels, to deal with them separately. And we do, and those are the judgments that we make. And we do this for 4 different years, and we put them together. The years are 2006 to 2009. And what's interesting is that Betson, in some appendix that he wrote back in 2011, made the following comment. He's called this a common sense approach. I agree with him. And what my colleagues and I did was to estimate this common sense approach. He says it's wrong because we ignore the den and similar situations with other expenditure patterns. And he's right. We do ignore it. But so what we do is simply use the common sense approach that Dr. Betson mentions here to find what the numbers say using that approach. And then compare that with the child support award amounts, which means we can estimate the imputed values. So we get the total award amounts minus the common sense numbers that I came up with. And then the difference is the imputed values. And it's really interesting, not just to look at this in principle, to look at the numbers. Any comments before I go on and give you the numbers? If you haven't looked at these numbers, you'll be surprised. Despite the fact that I used in my example of 0 additional housing costs, that's not what you find. For low income, for middle income, or for a high income, people spend more money on housing because they move. And these are our best estimates. And it's the numbers, we did it with 1 child, 2 children, and 3+ children.
And those are annual numbers, obviously,
These
right?
are annual numbers. So my hypothetical was wrong, and not, it was a hypothetical, not a true case. I think I tried to say that, but it's the same principle. And there's food. Why do we spend so little money on food with only one child? Clearly, the child eats more than that, without question. It's because there's always plenty of food at the table. There's always plenty of food at the table, and you can always share it with one more person. Isn't that correct? Does anybody have any doubt about that? I found a quote from some person, from some study, which says that 25% of food on average are thrown away. And you can all check your own households to see whether you think that's appropriate. That's correct.
Dr. Comanor, there's a question. How does the study compensate for the shift in expenditures between homes with children and childless homes? Because are the expenditures a shift to some degree?
No, here's what it does. It puts all households together in the same income class, corrects for income levels, and then adds a specific variable for families with one child, and then a second variable for families with 2 children, and a third variable for 3+ children, and looks at the increased expenditures on housing associated with the 3 child situations as compared with 0 children, which is what you get with those numbers are 0. And then it compares them.
So it's not really doing any shifting. It's just looking at intact houses or a single person house, single parent home. It doesn't matter.
This is only for married households. I did the data for married households. Actually, I did it for both, but these numbers are for married households. So it's not shifting, it's looking at the same data set and distinguishing the observations depending on the family structure. And for those of you who have ever used regression analysis, knows that this is a common use of this type of statistical tool. And it was peer-reviewed and published. So look, these are the numbers. Obviously, people eat more than these amounts of money for a year, of course. But that doesn't mean this is for the additional for the child. Most of it is the family produces something. I don't know about you, but my wife always cooks more than we can possibly eat. I think it's really sweet. There's always enough to eat, but sometimes we throw away stuff. And maybe that's true in your households as well. You don't need to tell me. Any comments about that, though? I would like you to know what you think about these numbers. I know they're just numbers. All right, that's food. What you find about transportation, at least in the United States, is that depends on the number of adults. Very few people don't have a car. Some do, but mostly people have cars, so it depends on the number of adults, not the number of children. If you had a family with two adults and no children, you would probably have 2 cars. If you had a family with 2 adults and 1 child, you would also have 2 cars. Maybe you would take different trips. Maybe you would go not to the park, but you'd go to the school or whatever. but in fact, your car expenditures wouldn't be much different. And so therefore, the numbers are not as high as you might think. Before we talked about housing, let's talk about transportation. What's the cost of a child in your transportation costs? Any comments about that? Brandy, you had something useful to say before, so I want to call on you because I think you'll have something useful to say here.
I mean, I do agree with what you have. Me having 2 children, we're, you know, my husband and I and 2 children, and we are now looking for a 4th car. Because, you know, each kid has to have their own car because they've got their own after school activities.
Look,
so they're kind of going in 2 different directions.
But you know, you're right. And I'm sure you're in the high income group where you can have 4 cars.
I'm a government employee.
Well, you know, I was a government employee too, but whatever. You know, most families don't have cars for their children. Although I have to tell you, I bought my son a car when he was in 11th grade for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah.
So, but that's not the norm. You and I both know that, right?
And they certainly don't have it before they're 16.
That's certainly true. And most children are below 16. And when your children were below 16, you only had 2 cars. Is that correct?
Correct.
And when you moved from 0 children to 1 child to 2 children, did you have any different car expenses?
No.
No, of course not. A little bit.
We had to get a new car because, you know.
Yeah, I understand.
Gonna get 2 car seats in the back of the car we had. So, but other than
of course
that, no.
happened, and that's why these numbers are not 0.
Yeah.
You know, they're not 0, and I didn't say they were 0, but they're not enormous.
Correct. And I agree with them. They should not be.
And they shouldn't be.
Generally, you don't need to go out and get a new car just because you have more children.
That's exactly right. And maybe your trips are slightly different.
Yeah.
But can I tell you something what the USDA does in housing and transportation costs? They divide transportation costs by the number of people in the household. So if you have a child, all of a sudden your transportation costs, 1/3 goes to the child. I just think that's crazy.
Regardless of the age of the child.
Regardless of, yes, that's right. I just think that's crazy. And I understand the logic in some sense, but that's not the way people live. Anyway, that's not what I did here. All right, let's go on. Now, this is children's clothing. They measure adult clothing with this data, and I measure children's clothing, and you get what you get. And it's interesting, this is really where the numbers are. These are higher numbers. And as you can see, you know, they're quite high at some point, and they should be. What we find is housing costs are low, much lower than childcare and education. I mean, that is clearly where families spend their money on children. Okay, now let's compare my incremental cost numbers with the Betson-Rothbarth estimates, where these models don't rest on expenditures, but the imputed compensation paid for adults for having children, and they do this by additional expenditures on adult clothing. I'm not making this up. You can find this in their own statements.
That does seem just completely ludicrous.
All right, here's the number of the table that I'd like you to pay attention to. These are my numbers. I call them incremental costs. And I'll tell you where these are the notes to that table. And you have a copy of the slides. All right. And here are the Betson-Rothbarth estimates. And as you can see, I got these out of the Georgia report because my co-author was from Georgia. So he picked the numbers from his state. So these are not the same as they are in every state, but these are the numbers from Georgia. And then you can see these numbers are really much higher. And then so imputed costs are necessarily the difference. If my numbers are right, and this is what the Betson-Rothbarth numbers are, the difference is imputed costs. Well, look at it. The imputed costs are more than the actual costs. The imputed costs are almost double. And it's different in different cases, but these are what the numbers show. It'd be one thing if the imputed costs were minimal. No one would disagree with it. But the imputed costs are essentially double incremental costs.
Which in some cases makes it triple of the combined of the Betson-Rothbarth, makes it triple of what the incremental cost are.
No, makes it double. Look,
well, if you look at your incremental cost for 3 children at 475, 47.45, and versus 12 to 216.
You get a number like 30 over 15, or 16 over 11, or 16 over 6. That's more than double. You know, it is what it is. You know, and you guys can figure out the numbers.
Get to the low income, but when we get to the low income, that's where the more negative impact comes into play for the lower income.
Look, the numbers are what the numbers are.
Yeah.
And I didn't cook them. I didn't make them up. But it seems to me if you're doing child support award amounts, you have to look at the relative numbers. It's not just the principal, but it's also how you measure this principal, because there's no actual expenditures. You're imputing it. How do you determine the value of the den? I mean, there are not many people who use it as an Airbnb. I assume there are some, but not many. How do you impute the value of an office? That's a tough job to do. And this is the way they do it using this model, and you see what they get. The point I would say to you is that using the Betson-Rothbarth model leads to imputed costs, which are on the average of double incremental costs. And they're not exactly double. You can look at the numbers. Maybe they're 1.5 times, whatever they are, they are. And what I do in the next slide is tell you exactly where I get these numbers from. They're all here, and all of these reports are online. Every one of them is online. Either in the California case or the Georgia case or wherever. So you can check out what's being done. Any questions about that? I think these numbers are astounding to me. When I saw the, the reason I'm here is to show you these numbers. Whatever you decide to do in your own wisdom, you'll do, and I will not be in the room and don't want to be in the room. But that song from Hamilton, I want to be in the room where it happened. Maybe you saw Hamilton. And I saw it. Let me tell you, this is the case. I don't want to be in the room. It's a tough call, what to do. But you ought to have the facts at hand. That's really all I'm saying.
I have a quick question just about this.
Sure.
You went through the different categories, transportation, clothing,
Right.
and then childcare and education. Are those all included in this?
Yes.
Costs?
Yes.
Okay.
I added
I'm just
them all
thinking,
up. Yes.
because we in Colorado, we're one of the schedules that has a adjustment for childcare, right? It's only included if it's actually an expenditure, and then it's divided between the parties in proportion to income. But this, as opposed to having like an average type of cost in the schedule, the basic child support obligation.
Look, let me be honest. I am stuck with the data I use. And I use the same data that the USDA uses. I use the same data that Betson and Venohr use. It's really the only data that's available. It's produced by the US Census Bureau, called the Survey of, whatever it's called, a Survey of Current Expenditures. And we had to buy it. You know, they sell you the data on disc for $35 or something of that sort. And we bought it for 4 years, and then we manipulated it. So I didn't make any of these numbers up. They came from the same source everybody uses.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So can you explain a little bit more about what these imputed costs are for? Are you able to identify that? I mean, we're not just talking about the den, right? We're talking about any number of potential expenses. This is not clear to me.
The answer is, I wish I could. What I did is estimate these numbers. That's in my research paper. I got these numbers from the Georgia report in the relevant years. And it was Georgia because my co-author was from Georgia, so he had the numbers at his fingertips. And then this is just subtracting one from the other. So if you're asking me what went into this, I don't really know. But I can tell you that the Betson-Rothbarth numbers are enormously greater than actual expenditures. Enormously. That I can tell you.
Could you explain a little bit more too about this clothing thing? You know, is this suggestion that people are spending more, like $3,000 more? Like, is that the, I don't get how they're arriving at these numbers based on the clothing expenditures.
Okay. The first thing I'm going to do is to find you their statement. It's better that you hear from Dr. Betson than hear from me. And because he'll tell you what he did. And so I'll try to find the relevant document and send it to Elise, and she can distribute it. Is that fair? All right. Next is my understanding of what she did, what they did. They did the same analysis that I did, except they only compared families with children and non-children, and now childless families with children on expenditures on adult clothing. And they found that families with adult clothing with children spend a lot less than families without children. Without children, families spend a lot more on adult clothing than they do when they have kids. Maybe that's consistent with your own experience. And they said that all of this differential is associated with the cost of having children, because you have to spend the money on children and you can't spend it on clothing, which you would prefer. But I don't want to put words in their mouth. So I'll try to find for you their statement and send it to Elise. Right? And it's probably in some California. They did a big job for California back a decade ago. And it's generally in an appendix, and I'll find it for you and send it to Elise. Okay, by that really is the best I can do. Imputed cost is just the difference between this and this. Column 3 is just column 2 minus column 1. And you could check that out.
And just to clarify, you're saying that all the incremental costs you have, the exact same numbers are used in the other model, the Betson-Rothbarth model. And to your knowledge, they don't have any other incremental costs you've left out. So everything that's a difference is this imputation you're referring to.
You know, I can tell you what I did. And I can tell you what I read, what the Rothbarth Betson estimates are in the state of Georgia at the same time period. So I can tell you these numbers and these numbers, but I can't, I feel I understand what they're doing, but I don't know them intimately. I only know what they've said. And I will find the relevant document and send it to Elise. So you will get a better feel for reading their words, not my words. Let me see if I have a slide that says something like that.
And one of the things that you've read is that they're using the same data set.
Oh, they're using the same data set. That I know. They've already said that.
From the expenditure, from the actual expenditure type.
Yeah, they use, hold on. Oh, here it is. They use the same data set. And this is what Dr. Venohr says about it. And here's the data set. Here's where she says it. And this is online in the Nebraska state government. So you can find page 5 of this appendix and you can see it.
So again, just for that, just point of clarification. So they're using that data set.
Here's what I would like Elise to do. Elise, it's not up to me to give you an assignment, but it seems to be on point. All right. If you go to slide 12 of mine, you'll see this footnote. And if you go to the Nebraska website, state government website, you should be able to find this report, and this report has an appendix. And the appendix was prepared by Dr. Venohr. You should be able to, and it says that. All right, and that's the date of it. And you can see the quote, which is on page 7. I don't need to send you what you can find. Is that okay, Elise?
That's fine, yes.
Because I'd have to do the same thing. And then maybe distribute it to the group. It's better that you see what they say themselves than to listen to me, because I might get their stuff wrong, and I don't want to do that. Joel, does that make sense to you?
Yes, that does. Yeah, I guess wanted to clarify. I can't think of what other expenditures there would be, but if there was others they had included that you hadn't, that might affect the difference.
It might,
in numbers.
indeed. I'd rather you check it out. All right, and we gave Elise an assignment. Now that wasn't nice of us, but it's okay. I hope it's okay. And you could find it. I have to do the same thing. And I've got students to teach tomorrow, so I can't quite do that. All right, let's go on. All right, we're at this slide. All right. So I don't really have an answer for what this includes. It's the difference between these two. And I just use this title, but if you want to use a different title, maybe I should have said just difference. Should I have done that? If I use these slides again, shall I not use imputed cost? Shall I use difference?
Imputed makes sense.
Well, Carl, I know your view. I want to hear what the other people say. I don't mean to put you down. All right, Brandy. Shall I use these numbers or shall I just say difference?
I think difference would be fine.
I think it would be too.
Yeah.
All right, I'll change it. I'll change it for the future because
Yeah,
I
'cause-
don't really know imputed cost. That's my interpretation. And I think Brandy's statement is fair. So I'm going to change that to difference. All right, let's go on. These are my costs. These are my notes to this table. And you can find out where these are, and these are all on the web. And the real thing is that people have really different preferences, not just different incomes when children come along. You want to stay home with your kid. So who needs more than a pair of jeans? That's not quite true, but it's true to an extent. All right. Here are my critiques. Dr. Venohr spends a good deal of time criticizing our results. And it seems to me I ought to sort of talk about her criticisms. And you can see the quote from her from a Minnesota document. She says, my numbers are impossibly low. The problem with that critique is that it implies that children live on the award amounts entirely. But since it's in a family, they live on the family awards expenditures, which would be the same. Let's go back to my den example, right? The child has the same household, the same room with or without award amounts, right? Michael, you're the one that used as a child, right? You put the child away now.
That's correct.
I don't blame you. But, whether or not you're compensated, the child will not be harmed. Is that correct? And so therefore, the child support awards are designed to promote equality between the parents. Fair enough. But that's not decisive on how much goes to the child. And that's the difference for those of you who've had economics between marginal costs and average costs. Maybe some of you have had economics, and remember that the professor emphasized that distinction. Marginal costs can be much lower than average costs. And so the amount of money, the amount of resources available to the child are not given by the award amounts, that the cost of figures that I have obtained, which are marginal or incremental costs. So that's my second point. That incremental costs do not reflect consumption amounts, and that's what her criticism suggests. I think this criticism is bad economics. Anyway, that's the point I make in this slide. And then here is applying that to the den nursery example. The child depends on the resources of the household, and often these resources are the same with or without children. Let me say that again. The child's standard of living depends on the resources of the household, and these resources are the same largely regardless of the same with or without children. And that well-being is not associated with these cost figures. So that's a misguided criticism. A second, well, you can read it. We're not talking about some optimal level of food expenditures. We're talking about how people actually behave. And maybe people don't eat enough appropriately, fair enough. But to use some optimal number as opposed to actual expenditures puts an undue burden on the obligor parent. I'm trying to sum up the difference between monetary costs and costs determined in this way. There are two questions. One is whether compensation should be paid. And the second is, how should this compensation be measured? The first is a policy question. As you can see from our discussion, there's a big debate over that. Fair enough. But the second is a measurement question. And I would suggest to you, we do not have a good way to measure these incremental costs. And maybe as Brandy suggested, it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis to determine. But guidelines require some sort of aggregate view. And that's not easily done on a case-by-case basis. So if you can move to a case-by-case basis, I think that's exactly right. But that whether or not that's feasible is another story. Isn't that right, Brandy? You know, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I mean, I'm wondering what about the feasibility of your approach, but God willing, if it works, I'm with you. The trouble, what we do now is it depends on the assumptions about adult children, which I don't accept. What happens with current circumstances? Well, you can read it. Any other comments? Shall I move on? All right, my last slide. Effective child support awards require the acceptance of the obligor. And while the obligor can understand actual expenditures, the reality is that so much of this is imputed to make up for costs that people voluntarily engaged in. Michael voluntarily had a child, right? And he's loving it from what I see. And yes, you know, he has to share his den. Let me assure you, Michael, that when your child grows up, you'll miss him and you'll wish you could share him. And the issue for all of you guys is, should Michael be compensated in these circumstances? And I have nothing more to say. I want to hear from you. All right. I'm running out of voice, and I'd like to know what you guys think about all this.
I have a comment / question. So the idea of the the difference between your model and the other model is that, so I guess this is the question part, is that your model is just focusing on these expenditures, whereas the other model is focused on, or also includes this like nebulous amount of cost difference between the childless family and the family with children, and measured by like there's spending on adult clothing, and the idea is that that's capturing more. Is that, do you get what I'm saying? Like maybe it's not just food, not just transportation, that there's all of these other sort of incidental costs that aren't being accounted for in any other way.
It's using differential expenditures on adult clothing as a vehicle to impute the value of the den. It's a mechanism to impute the value of the den and the value of the car, that, you know, the trips that are taken to the school, not to the park. It's
because I wonder, well, I'm just wondering if there's, you know, is part of the benefit of having that imputation, not just that it is capturing, or maybe it seems to capture expenditures that are not food and gas and housing, because there are other, like, you know, games and toys and activities and craft supplies. And
but look, we have all that in childcare and education. To the extent that the government does well in collecting expenditures, that's there. Now, maybe the government misses that. And I don't want to tell you that the government data set is perfect. But Jane Venohr and I agree that it's the best we have. So, you know, you're right about these, all these additional expenditures. And the issue is, are they really captured in the data set? And I can't tell you I know that. But I can tell you this is the best data we have. And there's no debate over that. And so therefore, I'm okay with imputing some level of cost to the missing office or den, but double,
Triple.
or whatever. You know, you guys can read the numbers.
So let me guess, what my point of disbelief in all this is just the logic of the Rothbarth model, using how the difference in adult clothing expenditure is the basis for all their calculations. That it just, I mean, it's just completely illogical to me.
Carl.
Yes.
I don't want to talk for Dr. Betson. I'd rather have Dr. Betson talk for himself. Why don't you invite him? You guys can invite him. Jane works for you. I'm sorry, Dr. Venohr works for you. Invite him. Let him answer that question. I don't want to put words in his mouth, although you should also get what he wrote in California in 2014. And Elise is going to find that thing for him, okay? Yeah. I don't want to put words in his mouth, because I'll get it wrong and he'll write to me and he'll say, you were wrong, you know, we'll get in a fight. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I'm not trying, and I'm not questioning what you're quoting in that reference either. I guess, again, I think that's where a lot of us are struggling, is again, just to grasping or coming to that realization that that's how it's calculated.
That Elise will send you the relevant appendix, and you should invite him. And if you invite him, do me a favor, send me the Zoom, because I want to listen too. Let me get to Elise. Elise, what do you think about all this? I hope you invite him. It's not my call, it's your call. But if you do, please let me in on it. I want to listen.
So our office, Colorado Center on Law and Policy, works with the University of Washington to put out the Colorado Self-Sufficiency Standard. And I don't know if you're familiar with that methodology, but so when I was looking at the slides, I was thinking about the methodology that is used in the self-sufficiency standard, which is nothing like either of these things. It's based on external things, not on expenditures, but on, like for housing, it's the 40th percentile of fair market rent. And for childcare, it's based on the state childcare cost survey, et cetera. And when I look at something like, for example, Denver County comparing a single adult to an adult who has a preschooler, the cost to meet basic needs is estimated as twice as much. So instead of $26,000 a year, it goes up to about $53,000 a year. This is from 2018. We're putting out a new one. And if I look at what made the difference between, how come basic needs doubled in price between a single person and a parent with a preschooler, the bulk of it is the childcare cost at over, usually exceeding $1,100 per month for a preschooler. And then also housing costs goes up by about $300 because they're assuming you might need a 2-bedroom. They're assuming that the parent and the child would not be sharing the same bedroom. When I read through the slides, and the den example just struck me as very odd. I mean, it could be our own experience of moving from a 500 square foot apartment to having to rent an entire house for 3 times as much money when we got custody of my husband's 2 children. And I don't know, is there data on what scenario is more likely, that people have a extra den that they can just make into a nursery versus somebody who might have to move or relocate based on needing more bedrooms?
There's a difference in economics between incremental costs and average costs. Incremental costs is the additional expenditures associated with having a child. Average costs are the total cost divided by the number of people in the household. And I don't know your survey, your study, but from what you said, it suggests the presence of average costs. And average costs are important and interesting, but that's not the same thing as incremental costs, because incremental costs is how much additional housing costs the typical family will spend when children come into the household. Right? Let me show you what my numbers show. My numbers show that with housing costs, it's nothing like the numbers you're talking about. It's with 2 children for averages over, for the average of 168,000. The incremental costs, that's 2 children as compared with the identical family with 0 children. The incremental costs are $4,000. Nothing like your numbers. Now,
well, I'm not looking at the higher income. I mean, this is based on basic needs. It's not, so more analogous to your lower income grouping.
All right, fair enough. But there's such a difference between incremental costs and average costs for most households. most households, if they want their own house, buy it without regard to the number of children. And then the child comes in, and maybe it's a very minimal additional costs. Now, there are many people like you had to do, but there's a lot of people that don't do that. And it's tough to generalize from one situation. This is the data set that comes out of the US Bureau of the Census. That's as much as I can say, really. It doesn't comport with your experience. Fair enough.
Dr. Comanor, you had mentioned, so you'd mentioned having on a case-by-case basis, determining what child support is. And it seems to me like incremental costs are based on a case-by-case basis, and average costs are based on, averaging across what, an obligor should pay or an obligee should receive. Is that right?
Could you repeat what you just said?
Yeah. Does incremental costs associate more to a case-by-case basis as opposed to an average? Am I on the right track here?
Not really, because incremental costs it measures the additional cost of having a child as compared with the statistically identical family without the child.
I see. Okay.
Regression analysis is designed to reflect incremental costs of having a child relative to without having a child.
Yep. Okay.
And so I just use a rather conventional form of statistical analysis.
Okay. I had another quick question. In one of your slides, you referenced child's well-being.
Right.
Which slide was that, and what was
I
the
don't know. Let me look. I got myself on a different. I
think it was closer to the beginning.
Well, maybe in the beginning I was talking about the den, right?
Uh-huh.
And the child's well-being is the same with is in the new room, right? The nursery.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not affected by whether or not the adults are compensated for the loss of the den or the office. The child doesn't care about that. The adults care about it, fair enough, but not the child. So the child's well-being is not impacted by that particular point.
Do you think that's a common thread among some of these costs, is that there's essentially for the parent, not necessarily the child, or it doesn't affect the child's well-being?
I don't think, in some cases, child support is really designed to provide equity among the parents. And that's appropriate. But very few parents would let their child suffer no matter what their support awards amount. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I agree with that.
What do you think? Brandy, I'm calling on you because you're articulate and you say what you mean. What do you think about that?
Well, you got to understand, I work in child support, doing
Sure.
the guidelines and
Sure.
assessing the guidelines.
But that's why I want you here.
Yes, the majority would do what they need to for their child.
Yeah.
You do have the few that it doesn't matter, they would make their child suffer if they did not get the child support order they thought they needed.
You're exactly right. I mean, that would be my views. Exactly. So
right, but there's also culture, and so I just really struggle with that, because I think that there's an assumption that just because they wouldn't do it the way the middle class would do it, or raise their children the way the middle class would, doesn't mean that they are making them suffer. Maybe there's a lot of just cultural differences or literacy issues. There's a lot of different things that are playing into it.
Look, of course, that's right. but so there's a lot of equity issues here. But child rearing is different from different people, right? Right? Husband and wives don't always agree about how the child should be reared, right?
In intact families.
I mean, I'm something of a helicopter parent. So, and that's really looked down upon these days. So, and I've had my disputes on that issue. But so parenting styles are different, and that's not the government's responsibility. I think Elise is right about that. I don't know. Any comment about Brandy? Because you're the right person for this.
I mean, I agree with Elise too. I think it could be cultural, but at the same time, when somebody just says, well, if I don't get this amount, then they're not going to get, new clothing, or, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. They're going to, it's kind of hard to take that as, okay, well, this is a cultural thing. No, this guy is going to, or this woman is going to make their child suffer because, the child support order comes out at $350 instead of $800, what they think they should be getting. So you do have, and then I have other parents that, give the child their monthly child support and they support them on their own. So it's I see a variety based on what
Of course you do. So we're trying to look for some average, because the guidelines have to be an average.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can say is the data give us averages. And I don't know that data is the best, but the Census Bureau, the National Census Bureau's Consumer Expenditure Survey is the best we have, and it's probably the best in the world. But I'm not telling you that it's always right. Anybody else?
I just want to reiterate this for my fellow commissioners, but yeah, most every parent, not all, but most every parent wants to support their children to the best of their ability. But when
You're right,
take,
but that doesn't mean that you don't have an equity issue between the parents. And that's
correct.
really what child support is involved in, and it should be involved in, but it should be based on the real expenditures, I think, not these imputed notions. That's my opinion.
And so even as much as I like all of your other statements and positioning here, I don't necessarily agree about the equity piece of it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You don't have to agree, Carl.
You're not the first person I disagree with. But again, most everybody wants to support their children to the best of their ability. Where the vast amount of the problem comes in, where the vast amount of the conflict comes from, where the vast amount of the everything challenge comes from, is when those support awards are tainted by providing some of that equity or providing some benefit for the X. And that's where the resistance comes in. That's where the lack of understanding comes in. That's where the perspectives come in. That's where so much of the people hang their hat on. If it's benefiting my kids, I'm usually for it. If it's benefiting my ex, I've got a problem.
Okay.
So there we go.
Any other comments? Elise,
Dr.
you gave
Comanor,
me 2 hours and I've used it up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know we're really at the end, but I'm just curious if you could leave us with a few takeaways or just some words of wisdom as this commission moves forward in determining different policy decisions. What would you leave us with?
I would leave you with the slide that's on the board now. I think that one should be wary of moving too far beyond full monetary costs. as defined by the additional expenditures for the same family with a child than without. Now, I'm not saying that there's no issues about the person who lost an office. I'm not saying that they're not, but it seems to me the current numbers are excessive. And how to cut that back, I don't have an answer. I wouldn't have begun with this model because I don't like this model, obviously. But you've got it now, and how you, and it's used by so many states. By the majority of states use this model. The majority of states use Dr. Venohr as their consultant. Maybe there's a connection there. But, and I don't want to be a consultant. That's not my purpose here. And I don't think I would accept that position. But I think you should consider hard how much of these imputed costs should be really added to full monetary costs. And that's my final statement.
Dr. Comanor, obviously we can read these studies and compare side by side, but do you have any table or matrices that shows the expenditures side by side, yours and
right here? These are my numbers. These are
right,
not.
but what those numbers are made up of. Do you have any table or matrices that builds that out?
The striking thing is that the Betson-Rothbarth estimates are not provided category by category.
I see.
They're not there because their methodology doesn't permit that. Their methodology gives you one number, not numbers per category. My numbers give you category numbers. The USDA numbers give you category numbers, housing, etc. And so therefore, my numbers are just additions. But that's not what you get out of the Betson-Rothbarth model. You get an aggregate figure based on one notion of adult clothing. So I don't know what else to say, because you don't get that. You ask Dr. Venohr about that, the possibility of getting estimates for housing and food and childcare and support, so forth. Ask her about that and see what she has to say.
Well, I know we're 2 minutes over, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I think this was really informative and a lot to consider. I encourage everyone to read up if they can on some of this information further. And I will look for the slide 12 resource paper to send to you all. And anything else? All right, well, thank you, Dr. Comanor and Commission and members of the public for joining us today. And we will see you all soon.
Nice to chat with you guys. Good luck with your efforts.
Thanks so much.